My family told me not to come to New Year's Eve because I would just make everyone uncomfortable, so I spent the countdown alone in my apartment. But at exactly 15 minutes past midnight, my brother-in-law called. His voice was shaking and furious. He screamed, asking what I did because Dad just saw the news and was not breathing right. My name is Olivia, and I am 33 years old. I never expected the first hours of the new year to involve an ambulance rushing to my parents' sprawling estate. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, who was told you would never amount to anything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe because you are going to want to hear how I responded to the family who threw me away. I was sitting on my worn-out couch wrapped in a thin blanket, watching the city fireworks from my small window, when my phone vibrated against the coffee table. The caller ID flashed Jamal. He is my sister Brittany's husband. Jamal is a 32-year-old corporate lawyer and a fiercely ambitious black man who usually speaks to me with dripping condescension. He has always treated me like an embarrassing stain on their perfect family portrait. I answered the call, slowly taking a sip of my cheap sparkling cider. Before I could even say hello, Jamal was already shouting into the receiver. Through the speaker, I could hear the piercing wail of ambulance sirens tearing through the background. I could hear my mother sobbing hysterically in the driveway. Jamal demanded to know if I was out of my mind. He yelled that he was looking at the Bloomberg financial feed on his tablet at the party. He screamed that my name was right there on the front page, listed as the sole founder of an AI supply chain startup that just sold for $1.2 billion. He asked me how dare I keep this a massive secret from the family. He said my father saw the live television broadcast right after the midnight champagne toast and immediately collapsed, clutching his chest on the living room floor. Jamal told me I was entirely responsible for my father having a severe heart attack. He said I humiliated them by letting the entire corporate world know about my massive success, while my own blood relatives were left looking like fools. I listened to his frantic breathing and the chaotic shouting unfolding at their lavish party. I did not panic at all. I did not ask if my father was going to survive the night. I simply set my glass down on the table and listened to the pure panic in his voice. I realized in that moment that they were not calling out of love. They were calling because they saw a $1 billion price tag attached to the daughter they had just banned from their dinner table. Jamal aggressively threatened that if anything happened to my father, he would personally use his law firm to sue me for every single penny I just earned. His voice echoed through the speaker so loudly, I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "You selfish, ungrateful brat," he spat out. The venom in his words was unmistakable. "Do you have any idea what you just did to your father? He is 60 years old and currently being loaded onto a stretcher because of your little stunt." I stared at the muted television screen in my apartment where the New York ball drop was about to happen. "What stunt, Jamal?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. "Do not play dumb with me, Olivia," he roared. We were all sitting in the grand living room waiting for the countdown. Your father had his tablet open to the Bloomberg financial feed like he always does. He wanted to check the Asian markets before midnight. Instead, he saw your face plastered across the front page. Jamal paused, trying to catch his breath, but his anger was bubbling over. "An exclusive report," he mocked, reading the headline aloud. "Reclusive tech founder Olivia sells supply chain artificial intelligence startup to Apex Global for $1.2 billion in a historic cash deal." My sister Brittany was screaming in the background. I could hear her high-pitched voice crying about how I had ruined their perfect holiday party and demanding the paramedics hurry up. Jamal continued his verbal assault. "Do you know what happens to a man when he realizes his outcast daughter has been hiding a billion-dollar empire while his own retail company is bleeding money?" His face turned purple, Olivia. He grabbed his chest and collapsed right into the crystal champagne tower. There was glass and spilled wine everywhere. "You did this to him. You kept this a secret just to spite us. You waited until the biggest family gathering of the year to drop a press release so you could humiliate your own father in front of his wealthy friends and the board members who were attending our party. I listened to the absolute absurdity of his accusations. My father Richard had spent my entire life belittling my ambitions. When I dropped out of college to teach myself how to code, he told me I was a complete embarrassment to his legacy. Now Jamal was twisting the narrative to make me the villain. He was making me the monster for achieving the exact success they swore I would never reach. "It is not a press release," I replied calmly, taking another sip of my drink. "It is a mandatory financial disclosure required by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The deal closed today, and the public record simply updated automatically. It has absolutely nothing to do with your New Year's Eve party." Jamal let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think you can talk down to me with corporate jargon," he snapped. "I am a corporate lawyer, Olivia. I know exactly how these acquisitions are timed. You wanted to destroy him tonight. You wanted to give him a heart attack to punish him for banning you from the family dinner table." I let his wild accusations hang in the air for a long moment. The silence on my end of the line was entirely intentional. I wanted Jamal to hear exactly how little his frantic energy affected me. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my cider, feeling the cheap carbonation tickle my throat. I did not rush to defend myself against his ridiculous claims, and I certainly did not offer any apologies for my success. "Jamal," I said, keeping my voice perfectly stripped of any emotion. "Susan explicitly told me less than 48 hours ago that my presence would completely ruin the holiday for the entire family. My own mother looked me in the eye and said I was a dark cloud over the household. She made it very clear that I was not welcome anywhere near the estate tonight. So if Richard is truly having a life-threatening medical emergency right now, you should be dialing 911. Why exactly are you calling the outcast daughter instead of a paramedic?" He gasped in absolute disbelief at my cold response. The chaotic background noise of the party seemed to fade, as his breathing grew heavier and more erratic. "You are a cold, unfeeling sociopath," he hissed through the phone. "Your father is literally fighting for his life on the hardwood floor right now, and you are sitting in your apartment quoting your mother from a dinner argument. You have absolutely zero empathy for the people who raised you and fed you." "I am simply following the rules you all set for me," I replied smoothly. "I was banned from the property. I am just respecting your strict boundaries." That was the absolute breaking point for him. The fragile facade of the concerned son-in-law completely vanished, and the aggressive corporate lawyer instantly took over. His tone shifted from panicked family member to a lethal legal opponent. "Do not think for 1 second you are going to walk away with that money, Olivia," he snarled. "You are completely delusional if you believe you can quietly pocket $1.2 billion while the family retail business is on the verge of total bankruptcy. That money belongs to this family. You built that tech while you were still financially tied to your parents." I raised an eyebrow at my reflection in the dark window. He was already trying to lay the groundwork for a massive lawsuit before my father was even safely inside an ambulance. "I am a senior partner at my firm, Olivia," he continued, his voice dripping with pure venom. "I will personally file an injunction and freeze every single one of your bank accounts before the financial markets even open on Tuesday morning. We are going to sue you for intellectual property theft and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We will drag you through the courts until you are left with nothing." I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I just pressed the red button on my phone screen and cut off his frantic screaming. The sudden silence that rushed back into my apartment was incredibly peaceful. I tossed the phone onto the cushion next to me. Jamal really thought he could intimidate me with his law degree and aggressive corporate vocabulary. He genuinely believed he could bully me into submission just like he always did at family gatherings. What my arrogant brother-in-law did not know was that my legal team at Apex Global consisted of the most ruthless intellectual property attorneys in the country. They had spent the last 6 months completely bulletproofing every single detail of this acquisition. Jamal was bringing a plastic butter knife to a nuclear war, and I was more than ready to watch him try to use it. I stood up from my worn-out couch and walked into my small kitchen. I poured the rest of my cheap sparkling cider down the drain. I did not need to drink cheap cider anymore. I walked over to the hallway closet and pulled out my heavy black winter coat. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter and slipped my phone into my pocket. A normal daughter would be rushing to the hospital right now with tears streaming down her face, praying for her father's survival. But I was not a normal daughter, and they were certainly not a normal family. I was driving to the emergency room tonight for one reason only. I wanted a front row seat to the theatrical performance they were absolutely going to put on. I wanted to look my father right in the eyes when he finally realized that the outcast daughter he threw away was now the person holding all the power. As I walked down the quiet hallway of my apartment building, my mind drifted back to exactly why I was spending this holiday completely alone. Jamal made it sound like I was just a bitter child who isolated herself just to be cruel to her loving parents. He conveniently left out the entire truth about the brutal family dinner that took place just 48 hours ago. He did not mention the disgusting piece of paper they tried to force me to sign while we were sitting at a high-end steakhouse in Manhattan. He completely skipped over the part where my father humiliated me in front of strangers and told me I was unfit to sit at their holiday table. I stepped out into the freezing New York night and unlocked my old sedan. The dark city streets were illuminated by the bright flashes of distant fireworks celebrating the new year. My family thought they had successfully destroyed my spirit 2 nights ago. They thought they had completely backed me into a corner. As I started the engine and drove toward the hospital, I could not help but smile. Just 48 hours before Jamal called me screaming about a heart attack, I was sitting in a dimly lit private dining room at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in Manhattan. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the pristine white tablecloth. My parents had invited me to what they called a holiday reconciliation dinner. I should have known better than to believe them. My father Richard sat at the head of the table swirling an incredibly expensive glass of red wine. My mother Susan sat next to him wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than my first car. Brittany and Jamal were across from me looking at me like I was a stray dog they were forced to feed. The waiter had barely cleared our appetizer plates when my father abruptly dropped his fake facade of polite conversation. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed the heavy paperwork across the table. It landed right next to my water glass with a loud, heavy thud. He did not ask how my year had been. He did not ask about my health. He just tapped his manicured finger against the front page of the contract and looked at me with cold, unfeeling calculation. "I need your supply chain algorithm, Olivia," he stated bluntly. It was not a question or a gentle request. It was an absolute command from a dictator. "You have been tinkering with that artificial intelligence coding project for years now. It is time for you to actually make yourself useful to this family." He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. "Our retail corporation is bleeding cash. Our logistics are a total disaster, and our shipping costs are destroying our quarterly profit margins. My competitors are crushing me, and I am not going to let my legacy crumble just because of some temporary shipping delays." I looked down at the document. The bold letters at the top clearly stated it was a complete and total transfer of intellectual property rights. My father took a slow sip of his wine before continuing his arrogant speech. "You are going to sign the rights of your software over to my company tonight. We will integrate your little computer program into our national logistics network. It will optimize our shipping routes and save the company millions." He smiled as if he was doing me a massive favor by stealing my life work. "In return, I am willing to let you run the information technology department," he announced proudly. "You will finally have a real job instead of just playing on your laptop in that tiny rented apartment of yours." He genuinely believed he was offering me the opportunity of a lifetime. He thought he could just snap his fingers and take the revolutionary technology I built from scratch just to patch up the massive holes in his failing business. He looked at me expecting me to eagerly pick up a pen and thank him for the privilege of saving his empire. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of my father's demand, Jamal leaned forward and folded his hands professionally on the pristine white tablecloth. Let us be completely realistic here, Olivia, he said using his sharpest courtroom voice. What you have built is essentially an untested beta framework. From a purely legal and corporate valuation standpoint, your little project has zero market viability without the massive infrastructure of an established corporation like ours to back it up. We are absorbing an enormous amount of operational risk by integrating an unproven algorithm into our national logistics network. Jamal reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out an elegant silver pen, placing it directly on top of the contract. He looked at me with a condescending smile that made my stomach turn. "We are prepared to offer you a one-time buyout of $50,000, he announced smoothly. That is an incredibly generous intellectual property acquisition fee for an amateur developer without any formal tech background. It will be structured as a complete and total buyout, meaning you relinquish all current and future claims to the software and its derivatives. You get a nice heavy check to clear your immediate debts, and we get the raw code to fix our supply chain issues. Everybody wins. $50,000. I stared at the silver pen resting on the legal documents and then looked directly at my brother-in-law. He was offering me the equivalent of a mid-level retail manager's yearly salary for a revolutionary artificial intelligence system. I knew for an absolute fact that my algorithm would save their failing corporation tens of millions of dollars in the very first quarter alone. It was not just a terrible lowball business offer. It was a calculated and deliberate insult designed to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh from across the table. She swirled the olive in her expensive martini and looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. "You should really just take the deal, Olivia," she sneered. $50,000 is probably more money than you have ever seen in your entire life. As the chief operating officer of this company, I can tell you right now, we are doing you a massive favor by even looking at your code. You have been sitting alone in that depressing little rented apartment for 3 years, typing up absolute garbage on your computer while the rest of us actually run a real business. My 30-year-old sister was the chief operating officer in title only. She had never managed a single supply chain route in her entire life and spent most of her workdays shopping online from her corner office. Yet she sat there judging my life choices with absolute arrogance. "You are pushing 33. Brittany continued, her voice dripping with fake pity. "You have no real career and you definitely do not have a husband. Take the money and move out of that run-down neighborhood. You might actually be able to afford a decent wardrobe and stop embarrassing this family every time someone asks what my older sister does for a living." After Brittany finished her insulting speech, my mother Susan decided it was her turn to perform. She is 58 years old, but she still uses the exact same emotional manipulation tactics she used when I was a helpless child. She reached across the wide table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over mine. Her heavy diamond rings pressed coldly against my skin. I immediately tried to pull my hand away, but she held on surprisingly tight, refusing to let me escape her grip. Susan let out a long, dramatic sigh, and her eyes quickly filled with artificial tears. The tears never actually fell, of course, because she absolutely did not want to ruin her expensive evening makeup. "Oh, Olivia," my mother whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "Why do you always have to make things so incredibly difficult for all of us? You have always been exactly this way ever since you were a little girl. You were always so fiercely independent to the point of being entirely selfish. You never wanted to share your toys with Brittany, and now you do not want to share your success with your own flesh and blood." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. She was completely rewriting my entire childhood history right in front of me to paint me as the ultimate villain. I did not refuse to share my toys when I was young. They simply took whatever they wanted from me and called me an ungrateful child if I dared to cry about it. But my mother was a master at twisting reality to fit her narrative. "We are giving you a real chance to finally be a meaningful part of this family." Susan continued, dabbing the dry corner of her eye with a crisp white napkin. Your father is losing sleep every single night worrying about the financial future of his company. Your sister is working herself to the bone trying so hard to keep everything afloat. We desperately need you to step up and do the right thing for once in your life. Do you have any idea how much it deeply hurts a mother to see her oldest daughter refuse to help her own family when they are struggling? She squeezed my hand harder, digging her acrylic nails slightly into my skin to emphasize her point. This is not just about some random computer program, Olivia. This is about loyalty. This is about showing us that you actually care about someone other than yourself. If you sign that paper right now, we can put all of the past misunderstandings behind us forever. We can be a happy, united family again. You can come to the grand New Year's Eve party, and we can all celebrate your new job in the technology department. Susan lowered her voice into a tone of grave disappointment. But if you walk away from this table without signing that document, you are actively choosing to destroy us. You will be the sole reason this family loses everything. The sheer psychological manipulation was absolutely suffocating. She was literally trying to convince me that protecting my own groundbreaking invention was an act of malicious cruelty against my parents. She desperately wanted me to feel guilty for not letting them legally steal my entire life work for absolute pennies. Susan looked deep into my eyes, waiting for the familiar, heavy guilt to break my resolve. She fully expected me to crumble and surrender just like I always did when I was a vulnerable teenager. She genuinely thought her fake tears would be enough to wash away my boundaries. I slowly pulled my hand out from under my mother's suffocating grip. I looked at her fake tears, and then turned my attention back to the insulting contract resting on the table. I did not cry, and I certainly did not apologize. Instead, I reached out, picked up the elegant silver pen, and calmly tossed it back across the table. It clattered loudly against Jamal's empty wineglass. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I am not giving you my algorithm for $50,000, and I am definitely not working under your failing leadership. My father slammed his heavy fist on the table, making the expensive silverware jump. How dare you speak to me that way? He barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. We are offering you a generous lifeline. You are not offering me a lifeline, I fired back, looking him dead in the eye. You are trying to use me to plug the massive holes in your own sinking ship. You sit there and act like my software is just an amateur project, but you and Jamal both know exactly how valuable it is. $50,000 is an absolute insult. My algorithm is worth thousands of times that amount. It is a fully functional predictive artificial intelligence that can anticipate supply chain disruptions on a global scale. It does not just optimize local shipping routes, it completely rethinks modern logistics in a way your outdated company cannot even comprehend. Jamal scoffed, shaking his head with a mock expression of pity. You are completely delusional, Olivia. No legitimate corporation is going to pay millions for beta code written in a rented apartment. Are they? I asked, leaning forward, matching my father's aggressive posture. Let us talk about reality then. Let us talk about why your retail empire is actually bleeding cash right now. It is not because of a temporary economic downturn. It is because you refuse to adapt to modern technology for the last decade. You completely mismanaged your regional distribution centers. You severely overpaid for useless warehouse space. You promoted people like Brittany to executive positions when she does absolutely nothing all day just because she is your favorite child. And now that your competitors are crushing you, you want to steal my hard work to cover up your own massive failures as a chief executive officer? The entire private dining room went dead silent. A waiter who had been approaching our table to refill our water glasses immediately turned around and practically ran back to the kitchen. My mother gasped loudly, covering her mouth in exaggerated horror, as if I had just committed a violent crime. Brittany stared at me with her mouth hanging open, completely speechless for the very first time in her life. My father glared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before. Nobody had ever dared to point out his blatant professional incompetence directly to his face. I could see the absolute fury boiling behind his eyes as he finally realized his classic intimidation tactics were no longer working on me. I was no longer the scared little girl he could easily bully into submission. I knew exactly what I built, and I knew exactly what my mind was worth. Richard stared at me for a long, terrifying moment. The silence in the private dining room was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air out of my lungs. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, towering over the table. His hands were visibly shaking, not out of sadness, but out of pure, unadulterated rage. He reached into his tailored suit jacket one more time. I thought he was going to pull out another aggressive legal document, or perhaps a pen to forcefully press into my hand. Instead, he pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope with elegant gold lettering embossed on the front. It was the formal invitation to the massive annual New Year's Eve gala hosted at his estate. He held the envelope up high so I could clearly see my own name beautifully calligraphed across the front. Then, without breaking his intense eye contact with me, he gripped the thick cardstock and ripped it entirely in half. The sharp tearing sound echoed loudly through the quiet high-end restaurant. Several patrons at nearby tables stopped eating and turned their heads to watch the commotion. Richard did not care about the audience. He put the torn pieces together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces of my invitation flutter down onto the pristine white tablecloth, right next to my water glass. "You have absolutely no right to step foot inside my house," he sneered, his voice vibrating with intense anger. "You are not a part of this family anymore, Olivia. You have completely lost the privilege of sitting at our table or associating with our name. I am hosting the most important corporate partners and elite investors at my estate for New Year's Eve. The absolute last thing I need is my ungrateful, arrogant daughter wandering around the party, making everyone completely uncomfortable. You are nothing but an eyesore to my legacy and a massive disappointment to your mother and me." He leaned heavily over the table, getting so close to my face I could smell the expensive red wine on his breath. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" he whispered harshly. "You think you can just disrespect the man who gave you life and put a roof over your head? You are nothing without my money and my reputation. You will spend the holidays completely alone in that pathetic little apartment of yours. And when your startup inevitably fails and you realize that nobody else in this corporate world is going to tolerate your terrible attitude, you will come crawling back to me begging to sign this exact contract. But by then, my generous offer will only be $10,000. Susan let out another dramatic sob, pressing her white napkin to her face, as if his cruel words were somehow deeply hurting her instead of me. Brittany just sat there with a smug, highly satisfied smile on her face, completely enjoying the public spectacle. Jamal adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking incredibly pleased that his cheap legal intimidation tactics had successfully pushed Richard to completely disown me. They genuinely thought breaking me down in public was their ultimate victory. They thought taking away a piece of paper and banning me from a holiday party would completely destroy my spirit. They desperately wanted me to feel the crushing weight of their rejection, so I would surrender my billion-dollar algorithm just to buy back their fake love. I calmly stood up from the table. I did not rush, and I certainly did not let them see even a fraction of the hurt they were desperately hoping to inflict. I picked up my heavy winter coat and my purse with deliberate slowness. My father was still glaring at me, breathing heavily with the torn pieces of my New Year's Eve invitations scattered like snow across the white linen. Susan was still putting on her dramatic crying performance for the benefit of the surrounding tables. Brittany was busy taking a long sip of her cocktail, looking incredibly triumphant. As I turned to leave the private dining room, Jamal decided he absolutely needed to have the final word. The arrogant corporate lawyer could not stand the fact that I was walking away from their abuse without shedding a single tear. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and casually unbuttoned his suit jacket with a mocking smirk on his face. "When your trash little tech company goes completely bankrupt next month, do not even think about coming to me for help, Olivia," he called out loudly, making sure the neighboring tables could hear his vicious warning. Do not come crying to my law firm, begging me for a pity job as a lowly legal assistant just to pay your rent. Because I will look you right in the eye and tell building security to throw you out into the street. You made your choice tonight. Enjoy your miserable, lonely life. I stopped walking and slowly turned back to face him. Jamal looked so incredibly proud of his cruel little speech. He truly believed he was the most powerful and intelligent man in the room. He genuinely thought my software was just a desperate amateur project that would inevitably crash without their financial backing. He had absolutely no idea that my elite legal team was already finalizing the paperwork for a historic billion-dollar corporate acquisition. He did not know that the algorithm he just called trash was about to systematically dismantle his father-in-law's entire retail empire piece by piece. I did not argue with him. I did not try to defend my company or my professional capabilities. I just offered him a small, chilling smile. It was a smile that visibly unsettled him, because it was not the reaction of a defeated woman. It was the calm reaction of someone holding a royal flush, while everyone else at the table was blindly betting their life savings on a pair of twos. I will keep that in mind, Jamal, I replied, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet dining room. Happy holidays to all of you. With those final words, I turned my back on my toxic family and walked out of the elegant restaurant forever. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the freezing Manhattan air, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation. That was exactly 48 hours ago. They thought they had officially discarded me for good. But as I pulled my car into the VIP parking lot of Mount Sinai Hospital tonight, I knew the real show was just about to start. The drive from my apartment to Mount Sinai Hospital took exactly 20 minutes. The streets of New York were mostly empty, as everyone was busy celebrating the new year inside warm bars and lively private parties. I pulled my old sedan into the brightly lit VIP parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the concrete walls as I parked my car and turned off the engine. According to Jamal, my father was currently fighting for his life. According to his frantic phone call, I was supposed to be rushing through the emergency room doors, with tears streaming down my face, begging the doctors to save him. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital lobby, feeling the sudden rush of warm, sanitized air. I did not run, and I did not ask the front desk nurse for directions to the intensive care unit. I simply followed the elegant signs, pointing toward the exclusive private waiting rooms reserved for high-profile patients. The hallway was completely quiet. There were no nurses shouting for a defibrillator. There were no doctors rushing down the corridor with a medical crash cart. The absolute silence was the first undeniable proof that Jamal had exaggerated the entire situation. I turned the corner and stopped just outside the heavy wooden door of the VIP family suite. There was a large rectangular glass window built into the door, allowing me to look inside before entering. I stood in the quiet hallway and looked through the glass. What I saw in that room completely confirmed everything I already knew about my toxic family. My father was not lying on a hospital bed clinging to life. He was not wearing a hospital gown, and he was not hooked up to any heart monitors or oxygen tubes. Richard was sitting completely upright on a plush leather sofa in the middle of the room. He was still wearing his tailored New Year's Eve tuxedo, looking absolutely immaculate. His legs were casually crossed at the knee, and he looked healthier than he had in months. He was holding his expensive iPad tightly in both hands, staring intently at the glowing screen. I could clearly see the bright white background of the Bloomberg financial application reflecting in his eyes. He was not checking his medical chart or reviewing test results. He was reading the exact details of my billion-dollar corporate acquisition. My mother Susan was sitting right next to him, leaning over his shoulder to read the screen. She was not crying or holding his hand in fear. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated greed. Brittany and Jamal were standing right behind the sofa, pointing at the screen and whispering excitedly to each other. Nobody was looking for a doctor. Nobody looked terrified or heartbroken. They looked exactly like a group of hungry predators who had just spotted a massive piece of meat. The heart attack was nothing but a calculated performance. It was a pathetic, desperate lie fabricated by Jamal just to drag me out of my apartment and force me into a room with them. They thought they could use a fake medical emergency to emotionally manipulate a newly minted billionaire. I took a deep breath of the sterile hospital air and reached out to grab the heavy brass door handle. I was completely ready to ruin their night. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped right into the private hospital suite. The soft click of the latch instantly drew their attention. 4 pairs of eyes snapped away from the glowing tablet screen and locked onto me. For a split second, the room was completely dead silent. I could see the rapid calculations happening in their heads as they desperately tried to figure out how to play this new situation. Then the most predictable and disgusting transformation took place right before my eyes. My father, the man who supposedly collapsed from a massive heart attack just an hour ago, sprang up from the leather sofa with the agility of a healthy teenager. The vicious tyrant who had ripped my New Year's Eve invitation into shreds just 48 hours prior vanished completely. In his place stood a glowing, incredibly proud parent with his arms stretched wide open in a welcoming embrace. "Olivia, my darling girl," he exclaimed, his voice thick with fake emotion and absolute joy. "You actually came. I knew you would not abandon your family on a night like this. I knew my brilliant daughter would come through for us." He took a step toward me, but I raised my hand, signaling him to stop exactly where he was. He lowered his arms, but the greedy smile never left his face. He looked at me like I was a walking bank vault and he possessed the only key. $1.2 billion, Richard said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "I have been reading the financial reports all night. You are an absolute genius, Olivia. I always knew you were destined for greatness. I always told your mother that your little computer projects were going to pay off someday. You have completely outdone yourself and secured the future of our entire bloodline." I stood near the door, looking at the man who had told me I was an embarrassment to his legacy just 2 days ago. He was acting as if the horrible things he said at the steakhouse had never happened. He was completely erasing his own cruelty and replacing it with a fictional narrative where he was my biggest supporter all along. "This is the perfect miracle we needed," he continued, clapping his hands together. "The timing could not possibly be any better. With that kind of massive capital, we can completely restructure the heavy debt of the family retail corporation. We can easily buy out our biggest regional competitors and absolutely dominate the national logistics market by the end of the year. Our company is officially saved, and it is all thanks to you." He said the words "our company" with so much entitlement, it almost made me sick. He genuinely believed that the fortune I built entirely on my own was automatically his to spend. He thought the money sitting in my new bank account was just a massive rescue fund designed to bail out his own professional failures. He did not see a daughter standing in front of him. He only saw a giant checkbook. Before my father could even finish planning how to spend my newly acquired fortune, my mother Susan rushed forward. She practically shoved past Brittany to get to me. Her arms were wide open, and her face was plastered with the most artificial smile I had ever seen. She lunged toward me, attempting to pull me into a tight maternal embrace. I took a quick step backward, holding my hand up just like I did with Richard. She stopped in her tracks, looking momentarily offended, before quickly recovering her fake, affectionate expression. "Oh, Olivia, my sweet, brilliant girl." Susan cooed, her voice dripping with an absolutely sickening level of fake pride. "I knew it. I told your father just the other day that you were on the verge of something incredibly massive. We are just so unbelievably proud of you, honey." I stared at her, feeling a cold wave of disgust wash over me. "You told him I was on the verge of something massive," I repeated, keeping my tone completely flat. 48 hours ago, you sat in a restaurant and told me I was a selfish failure who was destroying this family. You literally cried fake tears to manipulate me into giving away my company for $50,000. Susan let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh and waved her hand dismissively, exactly like she always did when caught in a lie. "Oh, darling, you completely misunderstood the entire situation," she said, her eyes widening in a desperately innocent expression. "You have always taken things entirely too personally. We were not actually trying to insult you or steal your work at the restaurant. It was simply an intensive psychological exercise. Your father and I knew you needed a final massive push to achieve your true potential. We purposefully banned you from the New Year's Eve party as a form of tough love. We wanted to ignite a fierce fire inside you. We were just using reverse psychology to motivate you to finally close your big corporate deal. The sheer audacity of her blatant lie was almost impressive. She was standing in a hospital waiting room actively trying to convince me that her cruel emotional abuse was actually a calculated parenting strategy designed to make me a billionaire. She genuinely wanted credit for the massive success she had spent years actively trying to destroy. She thought I was stupid enough to believe that breaking my heart was an act of parental guidance. And now that our little tough love strategy has worked out so perfectly for you, Susan continued, taking another small step toward me. It is time for you to share your new blessings with the people who pushed you to succeed. We are family after all, and family always takes care of each other. Since you have over $1 billion sitting in the bank now, it would be incredibly easy for you to pay off Jamal's expensive law school loans. He has been under so much severe financial stress lately, and it is really affecting his marriage with your sister. He is a good man, and he deserves a fresh start. You owe it to Brittany to help her husband clear his massive debt. After all, if we had not pushed you so hard tonight, would never have happened. I looked from Susan to Jamal, who was standing near the leather sofa trying to look completely innocent and highly deserving of a massive financial handout. The aggressive corporate lawyer, who had just threatened to sue me into oblivion over the phone, was now quietly waiting for me to write him a check. He had the absolute nerve to slowly nod in agreement with my mother, acting like clearing his personal debt was my ultimate moral obligation. They were all completely out of their minds. Before I could even respond to the ridiculous demand to pay off Jamal's student loans, Brittany decided it was her turn to step up to the ATM. She physically nudged her husband out of the way and walked toward me with a bright, gleaming smile that did not reach her cold eyes. The smug, mocking expression she wore at the steakhouse was completely gone. In its place was the face of a devoted, supportive younger sister who just wanted to share in my glorious victory. "I have been thinking about your transition into the big leagues, Olivia," my sister said, brightly twisting a lock of blonde hair around her manicured finger. "Running a massive tech division under a parent company like Apex Global is going to be incredibly stressful for someone who is used to working completely alone in a tiny apartment. You are going to need a strong, experienced executive team to manage the corporate side of things. Women really need to lift each other up in this cutthroat business world, and sisters should always stick together." She paused for a second, letting her fake feminist speech sink in before dropping her actual demand. "I am willing to step down from my position at Dad's company to come work for you," she announced, sounding as if she was making a massive personal sacrifice. "You can appoint me as your executive vice president of operations. I already have years of chief operating officer experience under my belt. I can handle all the boring board meetings, the aggressive media interviews, and the high-level networking. You can just stay in the back room and focus on doing your nerdy coding stuff while I run the actual business for you." The sheer level of delusion in her voice was absolutely staggering. 2 days ago, she laughed in my face and told me my software was complete garbage. She told me to take a pathetic $50,000 buyout just so I could afford a decent wardrobe and stop embarrassing the family. Now she was generously offering to become my boss. She wanted a multi-million-dollar salary, a massive expense account, and a corner office in a billion-dollar tech empire she did not spend a single second building. She genuinely believed her completely fabricated title at a failing retail chain made her qualified to run an artificial intelligence logistics network. I stood there looking at the three of them. My father wanted my money to save his bankrupt legacy. My mother wanted me to pay off her golden child's husband. My sister wanted me to hand her the keys to my entire corporate kingdom. They were standing in a private hospital suite circling me like a pack of starving wolves disguised in expensive designer clothing. They had pushed their greed and their shamelessness to the absolute breaking point. I took another deliberate step backward, putting even more physical distance between myself and their overwhelming greed. I looked at the three of them standing there in their expensive clothes, expecting me to simply open my checkbook and fund their pathetic lives. A cold, humorless laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet hospital room. "You people are absolutely unbelievable," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low volume. "You really think you can just smile and erase everything that happened? You think you can treat me like absolute trash for my entire life, and then suddenly pretend we are a happy family the very second I become wealthy? Let me refresh your memories since you all seem to be suffering from sudden, convenient amnesia." I turned my attention directly to my father, who was still holding his tablet like it was a winning lottery ticket. "48 hours ago, you ripped my New Year's Eve invitation into tiny pieces right in front of my face. You looked me dead in the eye and told me I had absolutely no right to step foot inside your house. You said I was nothing but an eyesore to your legacy and a massive disappointment to this family. You told me I was entirely unfit to sit at your dinner table and that I would never amount to anything without your money." My father's confident smile instantly faltered. The greedy light in his eyes was replaced by a flash of genuine anger. He opened his mouth to make an excuse, but I immediately cut him off and turned to my mother. "And you, Susan," I continued, my voice sharp as a razor. "You sat there in that restaurant, dabbing fake tears from your eyes while calling me a selfish, ungrateful failure. You did not ban me from the party to motivate me. You banned me because you were completely ashamed of my existence, and you desperately wanted to punish me for refusing to surrender my life work to your husband for pennies." Susan gasped loudly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, as her fake maternal warmth completely evaporated. Her face turned pale as the ugly, undeniable truth hung heavily in the air. Finally, I looked right at my sister, who was suddenly looking very nervous. "You told me my software was absolute garbage, Brittany. You said I was an embarrassment who needed to take a pathetic $50,000 buyout just to buy a decent wardrobe. You mocked my apartment and you mocked my entire life. And now you have the absolute nerve to stand in this room and demand an executive vice president position in my billion-dollar corporation." The heavy silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The fake welcoming smiles vanished from their faces completely. The carefully constructed illusion of a loving, supportive family shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the hospital room floor. They could no longer pretend they cared about my well-being. The masks had completely fallen off, revealing the ugly, desperate truth underneath. They did not love me, and they never did. They only loved the $1.2 billion currently attached to my name, and they were furious that I was refusing to hand it over. The heavy silence in the hospital room only lasted for a few agonizing seconds before my father completely snapped. The polished, sophisticated business executive vanished entirely. Richard slammed his expensive tablet down onto the glass coffee table so hard the loud crack echoed violently off the sterile walls. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged as he took a heavy, aggressive step toward me. "You ungrateful little brat!" he roared, his voice filled with pure venom. "You actually think you have the right to stand there and refuse me. You think you can just walk into this room, flaunt your new money, and disrespect the man who gave you life." He was no longer trying to play the role of the proud parent. He was completely furious that his ultimate authority was being openly challenged by the daughter he had always considered entirely worthless. He pointed a trembling, angry finger directly at my face, closing the physical distance between us. "I brought you into this world, Olivia," he shouted, spit flying from his lips. "I put a massive roof over your head. I paid for the expensive food you ate and the clothes you wore for 18 long years. I provided you with a privileged life that millions of people would literally kill for. Everything you are and everything you have ever achieved is because of me. You owe me your absolute loyalty. You owe me your utmost respect, and you owe this family your financial support right now." Susan flinched slightly at his sudden, explosive volume, but she did not even attempt to stop him. She simply stood safely behind the leather sofa, watching him unleash his toxic fury on me. Brittany took a small step back, clearly intimidated by his raging temper, but still entirely supportive of his aggressive financial demands. They were all perfectly willing to let him verbally destroy me, as long as it resulted in a massive payout for them. You do not get to just walk away with $1 billion, while my legacy crumbles to the ground. Richard continued, his chest heaving with heavy, frantic breaths. You do not get to pretend you built this corporate empire entirely on your own. You used my family name, you grew up in my house. In my eyes, you are my property, and by extension, your little technology company belongs to this family. If I tell you to save my retail business, you will do exactly what you are told. You will sign the necessary financial transfer documents, and you will do it tonight before you leave this hospital. I stood my ground, absolutely refusing to let his physically aggressive posture intimidate me. I had spent my entire childhood completely terrified of his explosive anger. I used to hide quietly in my bedroom whenever he raised his voice. But looking at him now, I did not feel any fear at all. I only felt an overwhelming sense of pity for a desperate man who had to resort to screaming about biology because he had absolutely no real power left over me. Giving me life does not give you the permanent right to control it, I replied, my voice completely calm against his raging storm. You stopped being a father the moment you decided my worth was tied strictly to how much I could benefit your corporate bottom line. My father was still breathing heavily, preparing to launch into another aggressive tirade about his parental rights when Jamal finally decided to intervene. The corporate lawyer smoothly stepped out from behind the leather sofa, completely ignoring the explosive emotional tension in the room. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and walked toward me with a slow, deliberate pace. The frantic, panicked brother-in-law who had called me just an hour ago was entirely gone. In his place was a man who looked incredibly satisfied and dangerously confident. Jamal did not look like a man whose father-in-law had just suffered a massive heart attack. He looked exactly like a predator who had finally cornered his prey after a long, exhausting hunt. He stopped right beside Richard and placed a gentle, restraining hand on his shoulder, signaling him to calm down. Jamal offered me a chilling, perfectly calculated smile that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He was thoroughly enjoying this moment. There is absolutely no need for anyone to shout, Jamal said, his voice practically dripping with professional arrogance. We are all rational adults here, and we can handle this situation like civilized business partners. Richard is simply expressing his passionate concern for the family legacy. But we do not need to rely on emotional arguments tonight. We have the law completely on our side. Without breaking his intense eye contact with me, Jamal reached down and picked up his sleek leather briefcase from the floor. He placed it carefully on the glass coffee table right next to the discarded tablet. The metallic click of the briefcase latch's opening sounded incredibly loud in the quiet hospital room. My mother and sister leaned forward, their eyes completely fixed on the leather bag, with greedy anticipation. They knew exactly what he was about to do. Jamal slowly reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents. He held the paperwork in his hands, tapping the edges against the glass table to straighten them out. This was not a hastily drafted contract. This was a massive, comprehensive legal filing that must have taken hours to prepare. He had not rushed to the hospital in a panic. He had gone to his home office, printed out these documents, and brought them here with the specific intention of forcing me into a corner. You see, Olivia, Jamal continued, his tone dangerously smooth. When I saw the financial news tonight, I did not just panic and call you. I immediately contacted my senior partners at the law firm. We spent the last hour thoroughly reviewing the specific details of your sudden billionaire status. And I must say you have made a very critical and incredibly foolish error in how you handled this entire acquisition. He stepped forward and held the thick stack of papers out toward me. I did not reach out to take them. I just stared at the legal documents and then looked right into his smug, highly satisfied eyes. He truly believed his expensive law degree made him invincible against someone he considered just a lucky amateur coder. You really thought you could just quietly sell a massive technology company without consulting the family lawyers, Jamal mocked, shaking his head in fake pity. You thought you could just take the money and walk away. But corporate law is incredibly complex, Olivia. There are strict rules about intellectual property, and there are massive legal consequences when those rules are violated. He slapped the stack of papers against the palm of his hand. This file contains an emergency injunction my firm is prepared to file tomorrow morning. We are not asking for a small financial handout anymore. We are legally demanding our rightful share of the $1.2 billion. Jamal tapped his finger against the thick stack of legal documents and looked at me with a supremely confident smile. Intellectual property law is a very fascinating and intricate subject, Olivia. He began, his voice dripping with condescension. It is not just about who finishes writing the final line of code or whose name is heavily featured on the corporate press release. The legal system looks very closely at the exact origin of the product. It examines exactly where the initial resources came from to build that specific digital asset. And according to my extensive legal research, you made a very costly mistake a decade ago. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, making sure my parents and sister were hanging on to his every word. 10 years ago, when you were just 23 years old, you were still living under your parents' roof, he said loudly. You had dropped out of your university programs and you were supposedly teaching yourself how to program software, but you were absolutely not doing it independently. You were using a laptop computer that Richard explicitly purchased for you with his own personal money. You were constantly connected to the private wireless internet network that was paid for by his retail corporation. You were eating food bought by his executive salary and sleeping in a bedroom financed entirely by his corporate success. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of agreement, crossing her arms and nodding vigorously. Exactly, Susan chimed in, looking at me with pure disdain. We supported you completely during those difficult, lazy years while you just played on that computer. Jamal held up his hand to quiet her, keeping his intense, predatory focus entirely on me. Under established corporate intellectual property laws, any product developed using company resources or equipment belongs fundamentally to the entity that provided those resources, he explained smoothly, using his sharpest courtroom tone. Since you used Richard's hardware and his network infrastructure to write the foundational base of your artificial intelligence algorithm, the core architecture of your software is legally his property. You did not build a billion-dollar technology company on your own, Olivia. You built it directly on the back of his financial infrastructure. He slapped the heavy legal documents against the glass coffee table, making a sharp cracking sound that echoed in the quiet hospital room. Therefore, the emergency injunction my law firm is filing tomorrow morning is absolutely not asking for a small family favor. We are officially petitioning the federal court to seize exactly 80% of your $1.2 billion acquisition payout. We are legally claiming that the vast majority of your corporate sale rightfully belongs to your father's retail empire as the original seed investor and resource provider. Brittany let out a sharp, joyful laugh from behind the sofa. 80%, she repeated, her eyes wide, with absolute unrestrained greed. That is nearly $1 billion. Jamal nodded slowly, looking incredibly proud of his ruthless legal manipulation. Yes, he agreed, a vicious smile spreading across his face. We are taking back what is rightfully ours. My firm will immediately file a restraining order against your assets. And until the court makes a final ruling, which could take years, every single one of your bank accounts will be completely frozen. You will not be able to spend a single dime of that Apex Global money. You will be right back to being the broke college dropout living in a pathetic rented apartment, desperately begging us to drop the lawsuit. Jamal let the terrifying threat of a massive asset freeze hang heavily in the quiet hospital room. He desperately wanted me to imagine waking up on Tuesday morning with zero access to my own bank accounts. He wanted me to feel the absolute crushing panic of losing every single penny I had just earned. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase one more time and pulled out a single sheet of paper along with an expensive silver pen. He deliberately slid the document across the glass coffee table, pushing it directly toward me. This is a full power of attorney agreement, he said, his voice suddenly dripping with a sickening layer of false sympathy. If you sign this document right now, you will legally grant your father the immediate authority to manage your corporate assets and negotiate the final terms of the Apex Global acquisition on behalf of the family. If you do this tonight, I will personally call off the massive federal lawsuit. We will not freeze your bank accounts, and we will generously allow you to keep 20% of the final payout. That is over $200 million, Olivia. That is more than enough money for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. My mother Susan nodded enthusiastically, taking a step closer to the table. You really should just sign it, honey, she urged, her voice returning to that incredibly fake maternal sweetness. A massive legal battle would be so incredibly exhausting for someone like you. You do not have the high-level corporate experience to fight Jamal's entire law firm. Just give your father the legal control he rightfully deserves, and we can all go back to being a happy, united family. You will still be very rich, and you will not have to worry about the stressful executive responsibilities. I looked down at the legal document resting perfectly on the glass table. The sheer audacity of their malicious plan was absolutely sickening. They were literally trying to use a completely fabricated legal loophole to steal the sweat and tears I had poured into my startup for the last 3 years. They genuinely thought they could use my old childhood laptop and a family internet connection to completely invalidate my personal genius. Jamal was standing there looking incredibly smug, fully expecting me to burst into terrified tears and immediately grab the silver pen. He thought the heavy threat of a federal injunction would completely break my spirit. Brittany crossed her arms and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Just sign the stupid paper, Olivia, she complained, rolling her eyes. Stop being so incredibly stubborn and selfish. We are literally offering you a peaceful way out of this entire mess. Do not make my husband completely destroy you in federal court just because you are too arrogant to share your success with the people who raised you. They had deliberately cornered me in a private hospital suite on a major holiday. They had ambushed me with a thick stack of aggressive legal threats and a power of attorney document designed to strip away my entire financial independence. Jamal pushed the silver pen a few inches closer to me, tapping his finger against the glass table impatiently. Sign the document right now, he commanded, his voice hardening into a direct threat. Or prepare to lose absolutely everything by Tuesday morning. Brittany let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed sharply off the cold hospital walls. She stepped out from behind the leather sofa, completely energized by Jamal's aggressive legal threat. She looked at me with the exact same mocking expression she wore when we were teenagers. You really thought you finally beat us, did you not? Olivia, she sneered, stepping right up to the edge of the glass coffee table. You actually believed you could just sneak away and become a self-made billionaire while leaving us in the dust. But you are always going to be the exact same pathetic loser you have always been. You are never going to be smarter than my husband, and you are certainly never going to outsmart our father. You are just a glorified piggy bank for this family now. Brittany crossed her arms, looking incredibly satisfied with her own cruel words. You spent 3 years locked in a tiny apartment writing code just to hand the entire fortune right over to us, she gloated. Thank you so much for doing all the heavy lifting, big sister. We will make sure to send you a nice little holiday card from our new yachts. My father did not even wait for me to respond to her vicious taunts. Richard was so completely intoxicated by the promise of a billion-dollar bailout that he had already moved on to his next corporate maneuver. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He completely ignored the fact that it was well past midnight on New Year's Eve. He scrolled through his contacts with eager, trembling fingers and pressed the call button, putting the phone on maximum speaker volume so we could all hear his absolute victory. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered on the other end. Thomas. My father bellowed into the receiver, completely disregarding the late hour. Wake up the rest of the executive board right now and get them on a conference call. I do not care if they are drunk or sleeping. I have the ultimate solution to our massive debt crisis. Thomas sounded incredibly confused, but Richard did not give him a chance to ask any questions. We are not filing for bankruptcy next month. Thomas? He announced, his voice booming with arrogant pride. I just successfully secured a massive injection of liquid capital. I am bringing over $1 billion directly into our retail holdings by Tuesday morning. Yes, you heard me correctly. $1 billion in completely liquid assets. The corporate restructuring will begin immediately. Tell the media team to prepare a massive press release. The retail empire is back on top, and we are going entirely national by the end of the quarter. Richard ended the call with a highly satisfied click and tossed his phone onto the glass table right next to Jamal's legal documents. My mother, Susan, was practically vibrating with excitement. She walked over to Richard and kissed his cheek, acting as if he was the brilliant mastermind who had just saved the world. Jamal stood tall, adjusting his suit jacket, looking like the ultimate corporate conqueror who had just delivered the winning blow. They were literally throwing a victory party right in front of my face. Richard pointed at the power of attorney document resting on the table. "Pick up the silver pen, Olivia," he ordered, his voice full of absolute dominating control. "The executive board is waiting for the official confirmation. Sign the paper right now so we can finally go home and celebrate my new fortune." I stood perfectly still and watched the absolute delusion unfold in front of me. My father was still staring at his phone, looking like a king who had just conquered a massive new nation. My mother was practically humming with joy, already planning exactly how to spend the money I had earned. Brittany was crossing her arms, looking at me like I was a defeated prisoner of war who had finally surrendered. And Jamal was standing there with his chest puffed out, entirely convinced his brilliant legal mind had just secured a historic billionaire victory for the family. He genuinely believed his completely ridiculous argument about a 10-year-old laptop and a family wireless internet connection was going to hold up in a federal court against a global conglomerate. He fully expected me to scream and cry and passionately beg him to drop the massive injunction. He expected me to desperately argue about how much I paid for my own internet bills, or how I had completely upgraded my computer hardware years ago. I did not do any of those things. I did not waste a single breath trying to debate the absolute absurdity of his amateur legal claims. Instead, I felt a slow, cold smile creep across my face. It was not a friendly smile, and it was certainly not a smile of defeat. It was the calm, calculated smile of an executioner watching a condemned man confidently tie his own noose. The sudden appearance of my smile seemed to severely confuse Jamal. He frowned slightly, his polished, professional arrogance slipping for just a fraction of a second. He pushed the expensive silver pen a little closer to me, tapping his finger against the glass coffee table once again to demand my compliance. I looked down at the power of attorney document resting perfectly on the table. It was printed on thick, expensive legal paper. The aggressive words on the page demanded total control over my personal finances, my intellectual property, and my entire corporate future. They wanted absolutely everything I had built during those 3 long years of total isolation. They wanted the late nights, the endless coding, the severe panic attacks, and the ultimate triumph. They wanted to steal my entire professional identity and slap their failing corporate logo right over it. I reached out slowly and let my fingers graze the cold, smooth metal of the silver pen. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp of pure excitement, genuinely thinking I was finally submitting to their ultimate control. Brittany uncrossed her arms and took an eager step forward, waiting to witness my absolute surrender. Richard put his smartphone back into his tuxedo pocket and watched me with incredibly greedy, commanding eyes. I picked up the pen and held it in my hand, feeling its heavy, expensive weight. Jamal let out a slow, quiet breath of relief, fully believing he had officially won the war. But I did not uncap the pen. I did not lean over the legal document to sign my name. I just held the pen up to the bright hospital lights, examining it casually. Instead of signing my name on the dotted line, I slowly lowered the expensive silver pen. I set it down on the glass coffee table right next to the thick stack of aggressive legal threats. The sharp click of the metal hitting the glass echoed loudly, breaking the triumphant silence in the room. My mother let out a small gasp of frustration, and Brittany immediately rolled her eyes, ready to complain about my hesitation. But I did not look at them. I crossed my arms firmly over my chest and turned my absolute focus entirely onto my arrogant brother-in-law. "You are a highly successful corporate lawyer, right, Jamal?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any fear. "You constantly brag about your senior partnership at your prestigious law firm. You always make sure everyone in this family knows exactly how brilliant and ruthless you are in a federal courtroom." Jamal frowned, his confident smile faltering slightly. He adjusted his suit jacket, clearly confused by my sudden shift in tone. "Yes, I am," he replied defensively. "And that is exactly why you need to sign that document, Olivia. You cannot possibly win a legal battle against my firm." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "If you are such a brilliant legal mind," I continued, taking a slow step toward him, "then I have a very simple professional question for you. Before you rushed to your home office tonight to draft this massive extortion letter, did you actually do your due diligence? Did you log into the public portal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office? Did you take 5 minutes out of your incredibly busy schedule to officially look up the registered owner of my artificial intelligence supply chain algorithm?" The hospital room went completely still. The greedy excitement that had been radiating from my parents suddenly vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling uncertainty. Richard lowered his smartphone, his eyes darting between me and Jamal. Brittany uncrossed her arms, her smug expression twisting into deep confusion. They did not understand the legal jargon, but they could clearly hear the undeniable authority in my voice. They could see that I was not a terrified victim begging for mercy. I was a trap that had just successfully snapped shut. Jamal stared at me, his dark eyes narrowing as he quickly tried to process my question. A tiny bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. He had been so entirely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate greed for $1 billion payout that he had made a fatal amateur mistake. He genuinely believed I was just a naive college dropout coding in a dark apartment. He assumed my intellectual property was completely unprotected. He thought he could just bully me into surrendering my life work with some aggressive legal vocabulary. "You did not check the registry, did you, Jamal?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "You drafted a massive federal lawsuit claiming 80% ownership of a technology product without even verifying who actually holds the legal patent. You came into this hospital room threatening to freeze my bank accounts and destroy my entire life based on an absolute legal fantasy. You thought you could intimidate me with a fake heart attack and a stack of printed paper. But a real corporate lawyer would have checked the federal database first." Jamal stood completely frozen for a long, agonizing moment. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered on his face all evening slowly began to fade away. He blinked several times, staring at me as if I had just spoken to him in a completely foreign language. The absolute certainty he had walking into this private hospital suite was suddenly replaced by a creeping, suffocating sense of dread. He tried to quickly recover his professional composure by letting out a loud, dismissive scoff, but the sound was weak and entirely unconvincing. He adjusted his expensive silk tie again, but this time his hands were visibly trembling. "You are completely bluffing," he stated, trying to force the heavy legal authority back into his voice. "You are just trying to stall because you know I have you completely cornered legally. The intellectual property rights of a dependent living at home are incredibly straightforward. You did not file any independent corporate patents when you were 23 years old living under Richard's roof. It is absolutely impossible." I did not say a single word in response. I just kept my arms firmly crossed over my chest and maintained steady, unbroken eye contact with him. My absolute silence was far more terrifying to him than any loud argument I could have possibly made. If I was lying, I would be frantically trying to justify myself. I would be sweating and panicking. But my calm, relaxed demeanor was a giant flashing warning sign that he had walked blindly into a massive legal trap. Richard noticed Jamal's sudden hesitation, and his greedy excitement immediately turned into impatient anxiety. "What is she talking about, Jamal?" my father demanded, his voice tight with rising panic. "What government registry is she talking about? Just make her sign the power of attorney document right now so we can finalize the corporate restructuring. We do not have time for her childish games tonight. I have an executive board waiting for my call. Jamal did not answer his father-in-law. The arrogant corporate lawyer could not afford to be wrong about a billion-dollar acquisition. If he filed a massive federal injunction based on entirely false ownership claims, his prestigious law firm would be heavily sanctioned by a federal judge, and his entire career would be completely destroyed. He quickly turned around and grabbed his leather briefcase from the glass coffee table. He forcefully snapped the metal latches open and pulled out his sleek silver laptop. He did not even bother sitting down on the leather sofa. He placed the computer directly on the glass table and flipped the screen open. "What are you doing?" Brittany asked, stepping forward with a deeply confused expression. "Why are you opening your computer right now? Just make her sign the paper, Jamal. Stop wasting time." "Give me 1 damn second." Jamal snapped back, his voice suddenly harsh and filled with intense stress. The hospital room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rapid, frantic clicking of Jamal's fingers hitting the laptop keyboard. The bright blue glow of the computer screen illuminated his face, highlighting the heavy beads of sweat that were now clearly visible on his forehead. He quickly connected to the internet and navigated directly to the official public portal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He aggressively typed in the specific name of my artificial intelligence supply chain algorithm and hit the enter key. He leaned extremely close to the screen, holding his breath as he waited for the federal database to load the official legal ownership records. The bright blue light from the laptop screen reflected off Jamal's face as the federal database slowly loaded the official search results. He leaned so far forward that his nose was almost touching the glowing monitor. He kept his eyes locked tightly on the screen, waiting for my personal name to appear as the primary owner of the intellectual property. He was completely ready to point his finger at the screen and proudly declare to the room that he had caught me in a massive lie. But as the official legal documents finally materialized on the digital page, the smug, arrogant expression completely vanished from his face. It was entirely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. All the rich color instantly drained from Jamal's cheeks, leaving his skin looking sickly and pale under the harsh hospital lights. He let out a sharp gasp as if someone had just physically punched him in the stomach. He quickly reached out and hit the refresh button on the internet browser, completely refusing to believe the words staring back at him. He aggressively typed the specific name of my algorithm again and hit the search key one more time. The federal results remained exactly the same. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. His expensive gold watch rattled against the glass table. The highly confident corporate lawyer who had just threatened to freeze my entire financial existence was now trembling like a frightened child. "What is it, Jamal?" my father demanded, taking an impatient step toward the glass coffee table. Richard was growing incredibly annoyed by the sudden delay. "Stop staring at the computer screen and print out whatever you need to print. We have to finish this power of attorney paperwork right now. My executive board is literally waiting on the telephone for my final confirmation. I already promised them $1 billion. Jamal did not move. He did not reach for his silver pen, and he definitely did not print any legal documents. He slowly peeled his eyes away from the laptop screen and looked up at my father. His dark eyes were wide with absolute panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. Richard Jamal finally whispered, his voice completely broken and entirely devoid of any professional authority. He had to clear his throat and try again. "Richard, the patent is not registered under her name. What the hell are you talking about?" My father barked, crossing his arms angrily. He clearly did not comprehend the massive legal disaster unfolding right in front of him. "Of course it is her name. She wrote the damn algorithm in my house. Just file the federal injunction and seize the asset like you promised me." "You do not understand," Jamal stammered, taking a step back from the laptop as if the machine itself had burned him. "I cannot file an injunction against this patent, Richard. She does not legally own the artificial intelligence software anymore. The official federal registry shows that the intellectual property was fully transferred and completely absorbed 3 years ago. The sole registered owner of this algorithm is Apex Global. We cannot sue them. They are a massive global conglomerate. If I try to file a fraudulent intellectual property claim against Apex Global, they will absolutely destroy my entire career. They will systematically dismantle my law firm and ensure I never practice corporate law ever again. Richard stood completely frozen in the middle of the room. The expensive smartphone he was holding loosely in his hand slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the plush hospital carpet. He did not even bother to pick it up. Brittany let out a sharp, confused breath, shaking her head, as if trying to physically dislodge the words Jamal had just spoken. Susan looked back and forth between her husband and her son-in-law, her fake maternal warmth entirely replaced by genuine bewilderment. They simply could not process what they were hearing. Apex Global. Richard finally choked out the name of the massive conglomerate, making it sound like a curse word in his mouth. What do you mean Apex Global owns it? She has been sitting in that terrible rented apartment for the last 3 years coding it herself. I saw her working on it. I stepped away from the glass table and looked directly at my father. You saw me working on system updates, Richard. I corrected him, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence. You saw me working on network integrations and global software expansions. You never actually asked me what I was doing because you were entirely too busy telling me my work was completely worthless. But since Jamal has already ruined the grand surprise, I might as well give you the full corporate timeline. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute liberation of finally speaking the truth out loud. 3 years ago, when my artificial intelligence algorithm was still just a working prototype, I secured a private meeting with the executive acquisition team at Apex Global. I explained slowly, making sure they heard every single word. They immediately recognized the revolutionary potential of my supply chain network. They did not offer me an insulting $50,000 like you did. They offered me a massive immediate buyout with an incredibly lucrative long-term development contract. Brittany leaned heavily against the leather sofa, her legs looking as though they might completely give out. So you sold it 3 years ago, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. Then why is your name all over the financial news tonight? Why does the Bloomberg article say you just made over $1 billion? Because the money that hit the news tonight was not a sale price. I replied, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. When I sold the patent to Apex Global 3 years ago, we structured the corporate deal with a massive performance-based earn-out clause. I agreed to take a smaller upfront payment in exchange for a historic financial bonus if my software successfully optimized their global shipping routes within 36 months. Jamal stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the legal disaster he had almost walked into. The $1.2 billion is just the performance bonus, Jamal, I said, looking right at the defeated corporate lawyer. And because I sold the intellectual property 3 years after I moved out of this house using hardware I purchased entirely with my own money, your ridiculous legal claim about a 10-year-old laptop is completely invalid. Jamal stared at me with a look of complete and utter defeat. The realization crashed into him with the heavy destructive force of a freight train. He was a senior partner at a decent corporate law firm, but Apex Global was a terrifying international monster. They had an internal legal department with an annual budget larger than the gross domestic product of several small countries. If Jamal tried to file a lawsuit claiming they stole intellectual property from a failing retail company using a 10-year-old laptop, Apex Global would not just swat him away. They would systematically annihilate his entire law firm. They would tie his partners up in endless federal litigation until the firm was entirely bankrupt and completely erased from the industry. His legs seemed to give out beneath him. He practically collapsed onto the leather sofa next to his wife, holding his head in his shaking hands. The thick stack of aggressive legal threats and the meticulously drafted power of attorney documents sitting on the glass table suddenly became completely worthless. They were nothing but expensive trash. Jamal knew with absolute certainty that his senior partners would fire him the very second he suggested going to war with $1 trillion conglomerate over a wireless internet connection. He had walked into this hospital room believing he was a brilliant legal predator, but he just found out he was nothing more than an ant standing in the shadow of a massive giant. I looked down at the silver pen still resting untouched on the table and let out a soft, cold laugh. "So, Jamal," I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room, "are you still planning to file that emergency federal injunction tomorrow morning? Are you going to march into the courthouse and demand 80% of a technology platform owned entirely by Apex Global? Because I am absolutely certain their army of ruthless corporate lawyers would love to have a good laugh at your expense. I highly encourage you to try it and see exactly how fast you get permanently disbarred." He did not answer me. He could not even look me in the eye. The arrogant corporate lawyer who had spent the entire evening verbally abusing me and threatening my financial security was completely broken. He had absolutely zero leverage and zero power. Brittany looked down at her husband in pure panic, finally realizing that her dream of becoming a wealthy executive vice president was entirely dead. Her husband could not legally bully me into handing over a single dollar. There was no massive family payout. There were no new yachts, and there was no corner office waiting for her. They had played their absolute best cards. They had lied, manipulated, threatened, and tried to legally extort me, and they had completely failed on every single front. The historic performance bonus was legally tied to my personal employment contract, making it completely untouchable by anyone in this room. My mother and sister were completely speechless, but my father was not finished. Richard could not accept the fact that the massive financial lifeline he desperately needed was officially out of his reach. He was about to learn that the nightmare was only just beginning. I watched Jamal crumble into a pathetic, silent mess on the leather sofa. The immediate threat of his ridiculous federal lawsuit was completely neutralized. But I was not finished. Surviving their pathetic attempt at legal extortion was never my ultimate goal for tonight. I did not drive all the way to this hospital just to defend my own wealth. I came here to actively dismantle theirs. I turned my attention away from my defeated brother-in-law and focused entirely on my father. Richard was still standing in the exact same spot, staring at his dropped smartphone on the carpet. His chest was heaving with heavy, erratic breaths as his brain desperately tried to process the fact that his massive billion-dollar bailout was a complete illusion. He looked completely aged and entirely broken. The arrogant corporate tyrant who had ripped up my party invitation had vanished, leaving behind a desperate old man drowning in massive corporate debt. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The heavy silence in the room shifted from shock to a deep, creeping dread. My mother, Susan, intuitively took a step back away from her husband, as if she could sense the incoming explosion. Brittany stopped looking at Jamal and turned her wide, terrified eyes back to me. "You really thought you could just snap your fingers and take my money, Richard?" I asked, my voice dropping to a cold, dangerous whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet hospital suite. "You thought the universe was just randomly rewarding you with a magical financial rescue package right before your retail empire officially collapsed. But you do not understand how a corporate earnout actually works, do you?" Richard finally forced himself to look up at me. His eyes were completely hollow. He shook his head slowly, unable to form a coherent sentence. His arrogant pride was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that I was holding the absolute power in the room. Let me explain the exact details of my contract with Apex Global. I continued, taking another step closer until I was standing right in front of him. A $1.2 billion performance bonus is not just handed out for writing a clever piece of software. A payout of that historic magnitude requires a massive, unprecedented return on investment for the parent company. Apex Global is a completely ruthless machine. They do not care about family ties or legacy or history. They only care about entirely crushing their competition and absorbing their market share. I tilted my head and offered him the coldest, most ruthless smile I could muster. Do you know what the specific condition was for Apex Global to authorize my $1.2 billion payout tonight? I asked, watching the last remaining drop of color drain from my father's face. Do you have any idea what my artificial intelligence algorithm had to successfully accomplish over the last 36 months in order to finally trigger that massive deposit into my bank account? The condition for my historic payout was incredibly simple. I said, my voice perfectly steady in the suffocating silence of the private hospital room. My artificial intelligence did not just have to make Apex Global faster or slightly more efficient. It had to completely and ruthlessly dominate the market. The exact legal phrasing in my executive contract stated that my algorithm had to successfully optimize their global supply chain while simultaneously and entirely crushing the logistics network of their biggest regional competitor. I let those words hang heavily in the air for a moment. Richard stared at me, his breathing shallow and erratic. His mind was finally starting to connect the terrifying dots that I had patiently laid out for him. I took one final step forward until I was standing mere inches away from him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. The arrogant tyrant who had demanded my absolute loyalty was now trembling under my gaze. "Have you really not figured it out yet, Richard?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Have you honestly spent the last 6 months completely blind to what was actually happening to your precious retail empire? You sat in that expensive steakhouse and confidently blamed your massive financial losses on a temporary economic downturn. You blamed greedy landlords and incompetent warehouse workers. But deep down, you had to know that the sudden, catastrophic failures across your entire corporate structure were entirely too perfectly timed to be a coincidence." I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as the undeniable truth finally began to set in. "Do you really want to know why your business is suddenly bleeding cash?" I continued, my tone completely devoid of any mercy. "Have you been wondering why over the last 6 months, a massive wave of independent trucking companies suddenly and mysteriously canceled their long-term contracts with your business? Did you ever question why your massive regional distribution centers are currently overflowing with backlogged inventory that you cannot afford to ship? Have you been sitting in your corner office tearing your hair out trying to understand why your corporate stock price has plummeted straight into the ground without any logical explanation?" Richard opened his mouth, but he could not form a single word. His hands began to shake violently at his sides, and his expensive smartphone remained forgotten on the floor. "It was not bad luck, Richard." I whispered, my words slicing through the room like a frozen blade. "It was not a shifting economy, and it was certainly not a natural market correction. It was me. My algorithm systematically analyzed every single vulnerability in your outdated logistics network and intentionally dismantled it piece by piece. My artificial intelligence predicted your shipping routes, undercut your transportation bids, and bought out the exact warehouse space you desperately needed. It strangled your supply chain until your company was completely suffocated. You thought you were fighting a losing battle against the modern retail market, but you were actually fighting my code and you never stood a chance. I did not just build a billion-dollar product. I built the exact weapon that destroyed your entire legacy." The absolute magnitude of my confession hung in the sterile hospital air like a physical weight. Richard stumbled backward, his knees finally giving out completely. He collapsed heavily onto the leather sofa right next to Jamal, staring blankly at the floor. He was entirely speechless. The undeniable truth was far more devastating than any legal threat or sudden bankruptcy. He had spent the last 6 months screaming at his regional managers and firing his senior executive staff. He had aggressively blamed the crumbling national economy, the shifting retail trends, and the lazy modern workforce. But the actual architect of his complete corporate demise was the exact same daughter he had relentlessly mocked and discarded. Every single one of those massive logistical failures was a perfectly calculated algorithmic move. My artificial intelligence did not hack into his private servers or illegally steal his confidential corporate data. It absolutely did not have to. It simply analyzed the public market patterns and identified every single glaring inefficiency in his outdated regional supply chain. When his failing company desperately needed transport trucks, my software automatically outbid him by just enough cents per mile to secure the drivers. When his regional distribution centers reached maximum capacity, my system strategically bought up all the surrounding commercial storage space, leaving his expensive inventory completely stranded on the loading docks. It was a completely legal, flawlessly executed financial strangulation. I had systematically choked the life out of his precious retail empire, and I did it entirely within the strict legal boundaries of the free market. There was absolutely nothing Jamal or his prestigious law firm could do to stop it. You cannot file a federal lawsuit against a global competitor simply because their modern technology is infinitely smarter than your aging executive board. You cannot drag someone into a courtroom for legally outperforming you in business. Apex Global deployed my sophisticated algorithm, and it did exactly what it was programmed to do. It optimized their massive national network by feeding directly on the rotting carcass of my father's completely mismanaged business. Brittany stood entirely frozen, staring at me as if I had just morphed into a terrifying monster right in front of her eyes. The arrogant sister who constantly bragged about her chief operating officer title had been thoroughly and publicly humiliated by a machine. She had spent her workdays happily shopping online in her corner office, while my silent code systematically dismantled her entire professional existence line by line. She finally realized that her expensive designer wardrobe and her luxury cars were completely gone. The family piggy bank was shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. My mother Susan covered her mouth with her trembling manicured hands. The dramatic fake tears from the steakhouse were entirely gone, replaced by genuine visceral panic. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel incredibly small and insignificant. They genuinely believed I was the weak, pathetic link of the family, who would eventually come crawling back to them begging for a low-level job. Instead, I had silently built a digital guillotine, and I patiently watched them blindly place their own heads right on the chopping block. Richard tried to stand up from the leather sofa, but his legs completely refused to support his weight. He stumbled forward, knocking his knees hard against the edge of the glass coffee table. The heavy legal documents Jamal had so proudly displayed earlier scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Richard raised his trembling hands and pressed them tightly against the center of his chest. His breathing was no longer the calculated heavy panting of a fake medical emergency. It was a rapid, shallow gasping for actual oxygen. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a terrifying shade of gray. He was finally experiencing the crushing physical weight of absolute financial ruin. For the last 48 hours, he had convinced himself that my billionaire status was his ultimate salvation. He had practically tasted the massive injection of liquid capital. But now the brutal, undeniable reality was tearing through his mind. There was no miraculous family bailout. There was no corporate restructuring on the horizon. His retail empire was not just struggling against a temporary economic downturn anymore. It was officially and completely bankrupt. The massive debt he had accumulated over the last decade could no longer be hidden behind clever accounting tricks or aggressive executive intimidation. The major banks would call in their massive loans by Tuesday morning, and he had absolutely nothing left to give them. He looked down at his expensive smartphone still resting quietly on the plush hospital carpet. Just moments ago, he had arrogantly called his executive board to promise them a billion-dollar miracle. He had ordered them to draft a triumphant press release to save his failing reputation. Now he realized exactly what was going to happen when the financial markets officially opened tomorrow. The global business news was already heavily dominated by Apex Global and their revolutionary new artificial intelligence logistics network. Wall Street investors are incredibly ruthless and entirely unsentimental. The very second the opening bell rang tomorrow morning, every single shareholder would immediately realize that Richard's outdated company could not possibly survive against my perfectly optimized machine. the massive market sell-off would be absolute and instantaneous. The corporate stock that Richard had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to inflate was going to plummet straight into the ground. By tomorrow afternoon, his shares would be nothing more than entirely worthless scraps of digital paper. His entire legacy, his absolute power, and his prestigious identity were all permanently tied to a company that I had just successfully eradicated. He gripped his tailored tuxedo shirt even tighter, letting out a low, guttural groan of genuine physical pain. The fake heart attack he had orchestrated strictly to manipulate me was rapidly transforming into a very real, terrifying medical crisis right in front of my eyes. Susan finally broke out of her frozen state and rushed to his side, her expensive high heels clicking frantically against the floor. She grabbed his arm, completely terrified, because she suddenly realized her limitless premium credit cards were about to be permanently declined. Brittany let out a loud, terrified sob, pressing her back firmly against the wall as she watched her father's invincible facade completely crumble to dust. Jamal remained entirely paralyzed on the sofa, too consumed by his own impending legal ruin to even offer a shred of help. The carefully constructed illusion of their elite, powerful family had been completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a room full of broken, desperate people who had finally run out of lies. Brittany watched her father physically collapse against the glass table, and she finally let out a piercing, completely unhinged scream. It was not a scream of genuine concern for the man clutching his chest in agony. It was the desperate, terrifying wail of a spoiled woman watching her entire universe burn to the ground. She lunged forward, her expensive designer heels slipping on the scattered legal documents covering the floor. She did not reach out to help Richard breathe or offer comfort to her panicking mother. Instead, she grabbed the lapels of Jamal's tailored suit, shaking him violently. Her perfectly manicured nails dug deep into the expensive fabric. "Do something!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her sudden poverty. "You are a lawyer, Jamal. So fix this right now. Sue her for corporate sabotage. Sue Apex Global. Get my father his $1 billion before the banks open tomorrow." But Jamal did not move to comfort his hysterical wife. He did not draft a new legal threat or pull another bluff from his briefcase. He simply stared blankly at the hospital wall as a completely new and far more destructive realization crashed into his mind. He was not just an outside legal consultant for Richard's retail empire. When Jamal married Brittany, he became the official in-house corporate counsel. And because he was a greedy, arrogant man who always wanted to maximize his personal wealth, he had structured his entire compensation package around corporate equity. He did not take a standard executive salary. He took massive amounts of company stock as his annual performance bonuses. He genuinely believed that Richard's aggressive expansion plans would eventually make him a multimillionaire when they finally took the company public. He had tied his entire financial existence directly to the rotting ship I had just successfully sunk. The sheer gravity of his absolute stupidity began to suffocate him. The stock market was going to open in just a few hours. The corporate shares he held were about to drop to a value of absolutely zero. But the nightmare did not stop there. Because Jamal was the primary legal officer, he was the one who had personally signed off on all of Richard's recent desperate bank loans. He was the one who had drafted the fraudulent financial projections to keep the creditors at bay for the last 6 months. He had actively hidden the massive logistical failures from the major investors to buy them more time. When the massive corporate debt officially defaulted tomorrow morning, the angry federal regulators and the ruthless bank executives were not just going to go after Richard. They were going to pierce the corporate veil and come directly after Jamal for massive financial fraud. He remembered the exact day he signed the equity agreements. He had sat in Richard's massive corner office drinking expensive scotch and laughing about how rich they were going to be. He had completely waived his standard legal retainer fees in exchange for a massive percentage of the company shares. He thought he was outsmarting the entire financial system. He thought he was securing generational wealth. Instead, he had blindly chained himself to a massive sinking anchor. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission was going to audit every single document he had ever drafted for the retail empire. They would see the artificially inflated warehouse valuations. They would see the hidden transportation deficits. They would realize that Jamal had actively helped Richard present a highly profitable facade to the public, while the company was actually bleeding to death from a million invisible algorithmic cuts. Jamal felt the physical room start to spin. With his equity completely wiped out, he had absolutely no capital left to defend himself. The prestigious law firm he proudly paraded around would instantly terminate his partnership the second the massive federal fraud investigation hit the news. They would publicly disown him to protect their own elite reputation. He was going to lose his law license. He was going to face multiple severe federal indictments. The massive banks would immediately seize his luxury cars, his expensive suburban mansion, and every single dollar in his private retirement accounts to cover the fraudulent corporate debt he had legally guaranteed. He was not just going to be poor, he was going entirely bankrupt, and he was very likely going to federal prison. Brittany continued to shake him violently, completely oblivious to the massive legal destruction happening inside her husband's head. "I am the executive vice president of operations," she sobbed uncontrollably, her makeup running down her face in ugly dark streaks. "I have a massive mortgage on the house. I have expensive car leases. You have to force her to sign the power of attorney Jamal. Use your legal connections, call the judge right now, and freeze her Apex Global bank accounts before she leaves this hospital room." Jamal finally snapped. He violently shoved his wife away from him so hard that Brittany stumbled backward and hit her shoulder against the leather sofa. "Shut up, Brittany!" he roared, his voice echoing violently off the sterile walls. "Just shut your absolute stupid mouth for 1 single second. There is no judge. There is no injunction. We have absolutely nothing left." Brittany gasped, holding her shoulder, looking at the man she married as if he were a complete stranger. "What do you mean we have nothing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rising panic. "My father runs a national retail empire. We have the company stock. We have the equity you earned. Your father's company is completely dead," Jamal screamed back, pointing a shaking finger at Richard, who was still gasping for air on the floor. "Her algorithm completely slaughtered us. Every single share of stock I own is officially toxic waste. We are millions of dollars in corporate debt, and I am the legal idiot who personally guaranteed those federal loans. The banks are going to take the house, Brittany. They are going to take the cars, the jewelry, and the country club memberships. I am going to be disbarred and prosecuted for corporate fraud because I helped your father lie to the federal regulators for the last 6 months." Brittany could not stop crying. Her entire identity was completely tied to her wealth and her fake corporate title. She was already thinking about her elite circle of wealthy friends. She thought about the massive country club galas she would never be able to attend again. She thought about the aggressive gossip and the public humiliation that would hit the internet by tomorrow afternoon. She was going to be the laughingstock of her entire social elite circle. The same people she had relentlessly judged and looked down upon were going to watch her lose everything she owned. She looked up at me from the floor, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of absolute hatred and pure terrifying desperation. She finally understood that I was not just the black sheep of the family anymore. I was the absolute, undisputed master of their fate, and I had chosen to show them zero mercy. The private hospital suite descended into absolute chaotic madness. Susan was loudly weeping over Richard, who was clutching his chest and refusing to look at anyone. Brittany dropped to her knees on the expensive carpet, pulling her blonde hair and wailing in sheer, unadulterated terror as the reality of her new, impoverished life finally set in. Jamal paced back and forth across the room, hyperventilating, his hands pulling aggressively at his expensive silk tie as he mentally calculated his incoming prison sentence. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, completely untouched by the hurricane of despair swirling around me. I watched the people who had tormented me for my entire life completely self-destruct by their own greedy hands. They had spent years building a massive house of cards, entirely funded by arrogance and financial fraud. All I had to do was write a flawless piece of code and let the free market blow it all away. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel any pity for the screaming woman on the floor, or the hyperventilating lawyer, or the gasping tyrant. I simply watched the absolute destruction of their toxic legacy with a calm, satisfying peace. The chaotic madness in the private hospital suite slowly began to shift into a pathetic, suffocating despair. Richard was still gasping for air on the floor, but the sharp physical pain in his chest was entirely overshadowed by the massive, crushing weight of his impending financial doom. He looked around the room at his hysterical daughter and his hyperventilating son-in-law. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that nobody in his immediate circle could save him from the federal regulators and the ruthless bank executives. His entire lifetime of ruthless corporate manipulation had finally led him to a dead end. There was only one person in the entire world who possessed the liquid capital required to bail out his massive, fraudulent debt. He slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me. The arrogant tyrant who had confidently ripped my party invitation into pieces just 48 hours ago was completely gone. Richard forced his trembling hands against the plush hospital carpet and pushed his heavy body upward. He did not stand up tall to assert his dominance. Instead, he dragged himself forward until he was right in front of me, and he completely collapsed onto his knees. The wealthy corporate executive who had spent his entire life demanding absolute obedience from everyone around him was now kneeling at my feet like a broken beggar. His expensive tailored tuxedo was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He looked up at me with eyes that were entirely devoid of pride or authority. They were just wide, hollow pits of pure, desperate terror. Susan watched her powerful husband drop to his knees, and the last remaining shred of her wealthy socialite illusion completely shattered. The woman who had spent decades looking down on everyone from her massive suburban mansion suddenly realized she was about to be entirely homeless. She let out a loud, ugly sob and scrambled across the room to join him. She threw herself onto the floor right next to Richard, dirtying her expensive designer dress on the hospital carpet. Her perfect evening makeup was completely ruined, with dark streaks of mascara running down her pale cheeks. She was crying genuine tears for the very first time in my entire life, but she was not crying for me. She was crying for her luxury cars and her elite country club memberships. "Olivia, please, Richard," whispered his voice, cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "I am begging you. You have to save me. You have to buy the retail company tonight. You have $1.2 billion from Apex Global. You can easily absorb the massive corporate debt. Just buy the shares and clear the bank loans before the market opens tomorrow morning. You can own the entire empire. You can be the chief executive officer. You can have absolute total control over everything. Just do not let the federal banks take my home and throw me into prison. I will do whatever you want me to do. I will publicly step down and give you all the credit. Just write the check and save my life." Susan reached out with her trembling hands and desperately grabbed the bottom edge of my winter coat. Her heavy diamond rings caught the harsh hospital light as she gripped the fabric like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. "You cannot just let us lose everything, Olivia," she sobbed hysterically, looking up at me with a completely pathetic expression. "We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot just stand there and watch your own parents be thrown out onto the freezing streets. We brought you into this world. I carried you for 9 months. You owe us your compassion. Family is supposed to forgive each other and stick together during the darkest times." I looked down at her hands gripping my coat and felt absolutely nothing but cold disgust. She was actively trying to weaponize the exact same biological connection she had aggressively used to abuse me for decades. She was begging for mercy, using the concept of a loving family that she had never actually bothered to build. "Please, honey." Susan continued, her voice escalating into a frantic, wailing pitch. "Think about your poor sister. Brittany and Jamal are going to lose their beautiful house. They will be entirely ruined. You have more money right now than anyone could ever spend in 100 lifetimes. It would cost you practically nothing to just pay off the federal debt and let us keep our lives. You cannot be this incredibly cruel to the people who raised you. We gave you a beautiful childhood. We bought you that computer. We paid for your food and your clothes. You cannot just abandon your own blood when we need you the most." Richard nodded frantically, his face completely covered in cold sweat. He reached out and tried to grab my hand, but I smoothly stepped back, forcing him to crawl a few inches forward on his knees just to stay near me. "I was completely wrong about you, Olivia," he cried loudly, completely abandoning every single ounce of his dignity. "I was a terrible blind fool. I should have recognized your massive genius years ago. I should have supported your technology startup. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I said at the restaurant. I was just stressed about the failing business. I did not actually mean any of those horrible words. I love you. You are my brilliant oldest daughter, and I am so incredibly proud of you. Please do not let them destroy me. Please buy the company." The sheer level of hypocrisy was absolutely staggering to witness. They were completely willing to rewrite history, discard their pride, and grovel on a dirty hospital floor if it meant they could get their greedy hands on my bank account. They were literally begging me to use the exact same fortune they had just spent the last hour trying to legally steal from me. Jamal had literally just threatened to freeze all my assets and destroy my life using a federal injunction. Brittany had just demanded an executive position while insulting my entire existence. Richard had just screamed that he owned me like a piece of property. And now, because their malicious legal extortion had completely failed, they were instantly pivoting to aggressive, emotional manipulation. They were frantically playing the victim card, hoping I was still the weak, desperate little girl who just wanted her parents to love her. They thought if they cried hard enough and used the word blood enough times, my heart would magically soften and I would blindly hand over hundreds of millions of dollars to cover up their massive financial crimes. They were on their knees praying to a god of wealth, and I was the only one standing in the room. Richard pressed his hands together as if he was literally praying to me. "You have to understand the massive legal trouble Jamal and I are in right now," he pleaded, his chest heaving with desperate, panicked breaths. "The federal regulators are not just going to bankrupt us. They are going to completely investigate the financial records. If you do not buy the company tonight and cover the missing capital, they are going to find the fraudulent documents. They are going to put your own father in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. You cannot let your father die in a concrete prison cell, Olivia. You have the ultimate power to make all of this completely disappear with one simple bank transfer." Susan let go of my coat and pressed her face against my shoes, weeping so loudly it echoed down the sterile hospital hallway. She was completely, utterly pathetic. The woman who valued social status above her own children was now completely reducing herself to a groveling mess. "I will be the mother you always wanted," she cried, her voice muffled against the floor. "I will listen to you. I will respect you. We will invite you to every single holiday party. We will tell everyone in our social circle how incredibly brilliant and generous you are. Just do not let the bank take my home. Please, Olivia, I am begging you as your mother. Save us." I looked down at the two people kneeling on the floor. I watched their tears soak into the hospital carpet. They were desperately waiting for me to pull out a pen and magically save their miserable lives. They fully expected me to be the exact same weak, obedient girl I was when I lived under their roof. They thought the biological guilt would eventually break me down. I did not move a single muscle to help them. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply stood there and watched the absolute destruction of their massive, arrogant egos. "Buy your company, Richard?" I asked, my voice echoing like shattering glass in the quiet room. "You actually want me to take my hard-earned $1 billion and pump it directly into a massive empty shell? You want me to buy a completely dead retail empire that has zero valuable assets, zero future market potential, and tens of millions of dollars in fraudulent hidden debt? That is not just a terrible business investment. It is absolute financial suicide. I did not become a self-made billionaire by making stupid emotional decisions to bail out failing executives." Richard flinched as if I had physically kicked him in the chest. He opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, but I did not give him the chance to speak. You sat in that expensive private dining room exactly 48 hours ago. I continued, my tone completely devoid of any mercy. You looked me dead in the eye and you told me I had absolutely no right to step foot inside your house ever again. You told me I was completely unfit to sit at your dinner table because I was an embarrassing failure who would never amount to anything without your money. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the absolute truth of the moment sink deep into their panicked minds. You were completely right, Richard. I really do not belong at your dinner table anymore. I am entirely out of your league. The financial and professional gap between our classes is exactly $1.2 billion tonight, and I absolutely do not sit at the same table with bankrupt criminals. Richard let out a low, pathetic groan and crushed his face against his hands. He knew I was entirely correct. He had completely destroyed his own bridge to salvation just 2 days ago. Susan let out another hysterical, high-pitched wail, tightening her desperate grip on my shoes. I simply stepped backward, forcing her to let go of my coat. She slumped forward onto the floor, her expensive designer dress now entirely covered in dust and hospital dirt. You do not get to play the loving mother card tonight, Susan, I said, looking down at her ruined makeup. You do not get to invoke the sacred bond of blood and family only when your premium credit cards are about to be permanently declined. You never actually wanted a daughter. You only wanted a quiet, obedient accessory that you could completely control and show off to your wealthy, superficial friends. When I refused to play your shallow little game, you threw me away without a single second thought. You completely banned me from your holiday parties. You let Brittany relentlessly mock my entire existence while you just smiled and nodded in agreement. And now that the federal government is coming to lock up your husband and seize your massive suburban mansion, you suddenly remember how to cry real tears. I continued, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. Your maternal love is completely bankrupt, just like your husband's fraudulent company. It has absolutely zero value to me. It cannot buy my forgiveness, and it certainly cannot buy a billion-dollar corporate bailout. I shifted my cold gaze toward the leather sofa where Brittany was still weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Jamal was still staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic with fear. You wanted me to pay off his massive student loans, I reminded them loud enough for the entire room to hear the absolute irony. You wanted me to make you an executive vice president, Brittany, so we could lift each other up as sisters. But tomorrow morning, the entire world is going to know exactly what kind of corrupt business you actually run. The federal regulators are going to completely tear through Jamal's fake financial documents. They are going to seize your expensive luxury cars and your designer watches to pay back the angry corporate banks. You are going to lose every single material thing that makes you feel superior to the rest of the world. You are going to have to find a real job. Brittany and Jamal is going to need a very good criminal defense attorney. I am not going to buy your rotting company, Richard, I announced, delivering the final, undeniable blow. I am not going to cover up your massive federal fraud to save your legacy. I am going to wake up tomorrow morning in my beautiful penthouse apartment, and I am going to watch the global financial news with a cup of hot coffee. I am going to watch the Apex Global stock completely skyrocket while your pathetic retail empire gets officially delisted from the public market. I am going to happily watch the authorities arrest you and Jamal for lying to the federal banks. You told me my technology startup was going to completely fail by next month. You confidently told me I would come crawling back to you begging for a pathetic $10,000 handout. I looked around the room, taking in the absolute chaotic destruction I had perfectly orchestrated. But the only people crawling on the floor tonight are you. The only people desperately begging for a financial lifeline are you. And just like you taught me for my entire life, I am completely deaf to your pathetic cries. I am walking out of this hospital right now, and I am never looking back. I did not wait for Richard to formulate another pathetic excuse, and I certainly did not wait for Susan to catch her breath for another round of fake maternal weeping. I simply turned my back on the entire room. The heavy wooden door of the VIP hospital suite felt incredibly light as I pulled it open. The chaotic symphony of their absolute despair followed me for a brief second. I could hear Brittany violently screaming at Jamal. I could hear Susan wailing my name in pure, unadulterated panic. And beneath it all, I could hear the terrifying heavy gasps of a broken man who had just realized his entire legacy was completely dead. I stepped out into the quiet, sterile hospital corridor and let the heavy door swing shut behind me. The thick, solid wood completely silenced their pathetic cries. The sharp click of the metal latch snapping into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the undeniable sound of total permanent closure. I did not look back through the rectangular glass window. They were entirely in my past now. They were nothing more than a bankrupt footnote in my massive corporate history. I walked down the brightly lit hallway, my footsteps echoing cleanly against the polished floor. The late-night hospital staff did not even look up from their nursing stations, completely unaware that a billion-dollar execution had just taken place a few feet away. I maintained a perfectly steady pace, completely abandoning the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood trauma with every single step I took. The toxic biological chains they had spent decades wrapping around my neck were finally shattered. I pushed through the main sliding glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the freezing New York winter night. The sharp, biting cold hit my face instantly, but it did not feel harsh or punishing. It felt incredibly clean. It felt like an absolute baptism. I closed my eyes and took a massive, deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, midnight air. For the very first time in 33 years, I was completely free. Right at that exact moment, the distant glowing clock on a nearby digital billboard struck midnight. The new year had officially arrived. A loud, thunderous boom echoed across the city, and the dark Manhattan sky suddenly erupted in a massive explosion of brilliant light. I opened my eyes and looked up as the New Year's Eve fireworks began to detonate over the iconic skyline. Huge cascading waves of sparkling gold and vibrant crimson painted the dark clouds. The magnificent light show reflected brightly against the tall glass skyscrapers. Millions of people across the city were cheering and celebrating the start of a brand new chapter. But nobody in this entire chaotic city was celebrating a greater personal victory than the one I had just secured. The old year was completely dead, and it took the toxic, pathetic remnants of my abusive family down into the grave with it. As the fireworks continued to light up the night sky, I felt a sudden, sharp vibration deep inside my winter coat pocket. I reached in and pulled out my smartphone. The bright, glowing screen illuminated my face, competing with the colorful flashes exploding above me. It was a secure, encrypted notification from my private offshore banking institution. I unlocked the screen and opened the highly secure financial application. The official transfer from the Apex Global Executive Treasury had successfully cleared the final international banking hurdles. I stared directly at the digital confirmation receipt. The numbers glowing on the screen were absolutely staggering. It was not just a 9-digit balance. It was a completely historic 10-digit figure representing the absolute pinnacle of technological achievement. $1.2 billion was officially sitting in my personal liquid accounts. I did not have to share a single penny of it with Richard. I did not have to pay off Jamal's fraudulent debts. The money belonged entirely to me. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my sheer intellectual dominance. Before I could even close the banking application, a second notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was a brief, highly professional email from the elite private aviation company I had contracted earlier that week. I opened the message and read the short, crisp text. "Good evening, Ms. Olivia." The email stated clearly, "This is your captain speaking. The private luxury jet is fully fueled and completely prepped for departure. We are currently waiting for you on the private runway at Teterboro Airport. Your preferred champagne is chilled, and the flight plan to your private island estate in the Maldives is fully cleared for takeoff. We are ready whenever you are." I read the words again, letting the absolute reality of my new existence wash over me. I was no longer the discarded oldest daughter forced to code in a depressing rented apartment. I was no longer the family embarrassment they desperately wanted to hide from their wealthy social elite friends. I was a self-made billionaire technology titan with a private jet waiting on the tarmac to fly me across the globe. I locked the phone screen and slipped it back into my coat pocket. I looked up at the explosive New York skyline one last time. The brilliant gold fireworks were raining down over the city like a shower of digital sparks. A sleek black luxury car silently pulled up to the hospital curb right in front of me. The uniformed driver immediately stepped out and respectfully opened the rear door, waiting for my command. I did not feel any anger anymore. I did not feel any lingering resentment or sadness. The people crying in that hospital suite meant absolutely nothing to me. They were just ordinary strangers who had made a catastrophic financial mistake by betting against my mind. I stepped into the warm, luxurious interior of the waiting car and sank back into the plush leather seat. The driver gently closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the city. "Take me to the airport," I told the driver, my voice calm and completely commanding. The luxury car smoothly pulled away from the hospital curb and merged into the empty midnight streets. I looked out the tinted window as the hospital building slowly disappeared into the distance. I was officially leaving the ghosts of my past completely behind me. I was a woman who had successfully claimed absolute control over her own life, and the entire world was finally mine for the taking. The story of Olivia teaches us a profound and unforgettable lesson about self-worth and the absolute power of personal boundaries. For years, her toxic family tried to define her value based on their own selfish metrics. They used emotional manipulation and relentless criticism to keep her feeling small and insignificant. But Olivia entirely refused to accept the false narrative they aggressively wrote for her. She realized that your true potential is never determined by the people who blindly refuse to see it. The most powerful takeaway here is that you absolutely do not owe your success to the people who actively contributed to your suffering. Society often pressures us to blindly forgive and financially support our family members, regardless of how terribly they treat us. We are constantly told that blood is thicker than water, and that we must always compromise our own mental peace for the sake of biological ties. Olivia brilliantly shatters this highly toxic expectation. She proves that walking away from abusive relationships is not an act of cruelty or selfishness. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and deep self-respect. When you quietly focus on your own personal growth and pour your energy directly into your true passions, you build an unshakable foundation. You do not ever need to aggressively argue with people who are firmly committed to misunderstanding your vision. Let your undeniable success speak for itself. Let your massive achievements silently dismantle their arrogance. True freedom is not just about acquiring financial wealth or reaching the absolute top of your professional industry. True freedom is looking right at the people who tried to destroy your spirit and finally realizing they no longer hold any power over your mind or your future. You hold the pen and you write your own destiny. If you found this story empowering, hit that subscribe button to hear more inspiring tales of personal triumph, and never forget to always bet on yourself.